Well, I hope you've had a nice easy day today, because we're going to do some pretty technical stuff tonight. As Paul said, we're talking about whales, design or evolution, and just in case you're wondering what sort of whales we're talking about, we're not talking about Wales the country, we're talking about whales the animal, not whales the fish, you know. But you knew that anyway. Okay, just by way of introduction, I want to start off with a quote which actually made me want to look into the subject of whale evolution. This is a quote from a paper in Nature. "The origin of whales, order Cetacea, is one of the best documented examples of macroevolutionary change in vertebrates." That's Numella et al. In 2004, it's in Nature. And that quote, that opening sentence struck me and thought, well, this is interesting. I'm a creationist, I don't believe in evolution. And here's this guy saying, we have got the evolution of the whales all sewn up. We've got it all documented. So I started looking into it. This is a reference if you want to look it up. Nature, 12th of August 2004. But when I'm thinking about this, I was reminded of something else that somebody said. And the next time somebody tells you that something is true, why not say to them, what kind of evidence is there for that? And if they can't give you a good answer, I hope that you will think very carefully before you believe a word they say. Who said that? Any idea? Apart from my wife, who knows? Any guesses? Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins said this. So, I'm going to take the advice of Professor Dawkins, and let's have a look at the evidence. So, just an outline of my talk. We're going to start off looking at the fossils. We're going to look at the sound transmission mechanisms that you find in these fossils and you find in marine animals and whales. We're going to look at their locomotor behavior, only in one little detail, how they move around and how they navigate through the sea. We're going to do some embryology and some genetics as well, so that's why I said I hope you had a nice easy day today, because we're going to get to some heavy stuff. And we're going to look at limb vestiges. The whales are supposed to have limb vestiges. And we're going to look at atavistic hind limbs that whales are supposed to have. And then we're going to round out with a little review of the design of these animals and the design of whales, and try and draw some conclusions about the supposed evolution of whales. So the fossils. There are about 30 different fossil species of the so-called archaeocetes. Archaeocete just means old whale. Whether they are old whales or not is a question which I'm going to leave open for the moment. And the first family of fossil whales, as they're called, is Pachycetidae. These are the Pakistani whales. Then you've got Ambulocetidae. And then you've got something that sounds like a razor, Remingtonocetidae, and the Protocetidae, and the Basilosauridae, and the Dorodontidae could be sometimes grouped with the Basilosaurids, but they're pretty much very similar. So you've got at least 5 families, possibly 6 families, depending on how you split them up. And these are the fossils. There are 30 different fossil species which have been identified in these groups. And if you look up the literature, you could get nice family trees of whales. And you've got the fossil whales down here, which we're going to look at. And then you've got the modern baleen whales. These are the ones that with the krill, the blue whale, the humpback whale. And then you've got the Ondoceti, which are the toothed whales like killer whales, sperm whales. And they all seem to be nicely connected. And you can find nice little family trees here with the fossil whales, with the reconstructions of these various creatures. And it all looks very nice and smooth and convincing. Well, let's have a look at the detail. You always need to look at the detail. I find that whenever you get a claim made by an evolutionist, it's always good to go and have a look at the detail. What's that based on? So let's start looking at the Pachycetids. And we're going to talk about ear bones, because how do you identify how can you tell whether you have a whale or not in front of you? When you have a specimen, when you have a skull, how do you know whether it's from a whale or not? Well, the way you know is you look at its ear. Well, we'll get into it. All right, we look for what's called the involucrum. Here is a CT scan of part of the ear of the Pachycetid fossil. And there's this big lump of bone here called the involucrum. And the eardrum is here, in case you're wondering where the eardrum is. And the bones that connect the eardrum to the cochlea are found in here. But all whales have this big lump of bone in their ear, which you don't have and I don't have. and most mammals don't have. Some mammals do have them though. And you also get they call pachyostosis. In other words, the ear bones become more massive and bigger than you would normally expect weight for weight in a mammal that lives on land. And you get pachiosclerosis, high density, heavy mineralization of the bones. So the bones in the ear are much heavier and more solid than the bones that we have in our ears. And this is a picture of the fossil bone of a pachycetid, the fossil ear bones, and they go in there, in this gap here, and they are, I haven't got a picture you can compare with directly, but they are much more massive, much more solid than the ear bones of something like, say, a horse or a hippopotamus or a camel. And that's how you tell whether you have a whale or not. If you've got the involucrum and you've got these massive inner ear bones, you've got a whale. So we're told. Also, if you look at the teeth, the connecting features for the fossil whales, the so-called fossil whales, are the teeth. They all have very similar teeth and quite similar skulls. So some of the features of the skulls and the bones at the rear of the skull connect the fossil whales together. So there's similarities, but it doesn't really help very much when you get to the modern whales. So let's have a look a bit more at the detail of pachycetus. Here's a picture of the various bones they found and they put together. Obviously an animal with 4 legs, long tail, reckoned to be a bit like a wolf that could run around. Here's a diagram showing it drawn out, a bit more detail. And here's a reconstruction of pachycetus that you'll find on the internet if you go looking. Credits to Carl Buell who drew this. And this is what they reckon it looked like. Just here though, it's worth mentioning the small cautionary tale. Here is a picture of Science, April 1983, and here is a picture of pachycetus. This was when they first discovered the first fossil pachycetus, and they discovered the skull. And from the skull, they drew this picture of it swimming around the sea with flippers, catching fish. And then later on, they discovered a few more bones, a more complete skeleton, and it suddenly became this. So when evolutionists come up with some stories about how much they can tell from a small bit of bone, a skull, sometimes we have to be a little careful, and perhaps it's worth waiting until they have more evidence before we draw any conclusions. And the evolutionists, I hope, have learnt the lesson too, because here they really showed themselves to be rather foolish in reconstructing this animal from a skull, and when they've got the legs and the backbone and the tail, it looked a bit more like a wolf. So a cautionary tale. Right, let's have a look at ambulocetus. Ambulocetus is one that's quite well known. It's about 4 meters long, about 12 feet long, large crocodile-like creature. It could move both on land and in water, and it had very robust jaws and teeth, but very similar to the pachycetus. This is the connection. They say, well, okay, we believe there's a connection between the two. There's also a connection in the ankle bones as well, actually. And here we have a picture of a skeleton of ambulocetus, rather complete. They seem to have most of it. The earlier skeletons were a bit more incomplete, and they weren't too sure about the rear legs. But here we have a normal pelvis, normal rear legs, and it's been put in a position which suggests it's swimming through the water, which is what it probably did. And here's a picture, a reconstruction of one of these beasties on the edge of the river, getting its supper. This unfortunate creature is becoming dinner. So that's ambulocetus. But that means walking whale. So the idea is that these whales once walked. Then we've got Remingtonocetus. It had a very long, narrow snout, but had fully functional limbs again, 4 legs. But it's the smallest of the archaeosaurs. It's about the size of an otter. And in fact, the reconstructions that they give from, mainly from the skull again, are some sort of otter-like creature. As I say, not very large as a bird for comparison. Not very big. Quite a small little, cute little animal with a long snout. Looks very much like an otter. And the creatures so far have either been land creatures. Pachycetus was a land creature, and the others were creatures suspected to live in rivers, because that's the kind of deposits they were found in. And we then go to the Protocetidae. And there are various species in this group, but they all had 4 short limbs, and they seem to be again adapted for an amphibious existence, and slightly smaller than Ambulocetus. And these were found in marine deposits, so some evidence here suggests that the type of rock that they're found in is what you would get usually when you get deposition under salt water, so you can recognise the kind of habitat that it was living in. And Rhodocetus is one of the best known representatives of this family, but here we're missing quite a few bones, in fact. They haven't got the 4 limbs, but the rear limbs they do have, and they're quite small. But it was basically a seal-like creature, and probably had a lifestyle very much like the modern-day seals. Then we come to my favourite. This is definitely a very weird creature called Basilosaurus, or from the family Basilosauridae, and you'll probably guess from saurid that that sounds a bit like a dinosaur. When they first found it, they thought it was a dinosaur. They thought it was a reptile rather than a mammal. It was later reclassified as a mammal, mainly on the basis of its teeth, which is the main way you tell whether you've got a mammal or a reptile. And this thing was about 14 to 24 metres long, and some people say it might have had a tail fluke, like the tail of the whale, but that's not entirely certain, and some people suggest that because of the type of joint at the end of the tail, it had a fluke like a normal whale, but I will reckon that's rather unlikely. It's very odd because its vertebrae were very elongated, and its head was relatively small compared with, especially if you compare it with a modern whale, where the head is actually relatively large, but it did have complete hind limbs, very small complete hind limbs. And here we have Basilosaurus, which is the main representative of this species, and as you see, very long creature. And here you have some legs, very small. I've done my own reconstruction of this one because I didn't like the reconstructions that other people did, so the drawing's not very good quality, but it gives you the general idea. It was a very large eel-like animal, 24 metres long, that's about 60, 70 feet. And then you've got the Dorodontidae, dolphin-like creatures, which also had complete hind limbs, very small complete hind limbs. But they were not attached to any pelvis, they were just sort of floating in the body wall without any attachment to the pelvis and the spine. And they might have had a tail fluke, we can't really be sure. And here's the almost complete skeleton of one of the representatives of this family, and here you can see its hind legs. So there's the fossils that supposedly tell you the story of how whales evolved from something that ran around on land and is now fully adapted to the life in the sea. And here I just want to pause and have a little think about the evolutionary timescale. Now, the evolutionists tell us that the transition from Pachycetus to Basilosaurus was less than 15 million years. 15 million years is the longest they give themselves. Some people say it's even as short as 8 million years. Now this is not Darwinian evolution, this is not slow gradual change, this is massive rapid evolution. We were supposed to have taken 5 million years to evolve from an ape, and the difference between us and an ape is quite small, superficially, in terms of anatomy. But I just sort of put that one in, just make sure. But here we have simultaneous mutations in many different body systems over a short period of time to produce an extremely well adapted marine mammal from what was essentially a very well adapted terrestrial mammal. So you've gone from this to this in 15 million years maximum. That's quite a stretch even for an evolutionist. But they never stop and say, well, hang on a minute, can we actually sustain this kind of argument? And I would suggest to you that they can't. And I certainly have grave doubts about whether you can actually proceed that fast in evolution. You certainly can't do it by a Darwinian mechanism, which is slow, gradual changes. That's the essence of Darwinianism. Okay. Now, the evolutionists also like to do some work on the middle ear, and this is in fact the paper I quoted right at the beginning from Numella, and they looked at the middle ear of the whales, or fossil whales and some modern whales, or a modern representative of the family. They took the ear from Pachycetus, or Pachycetids, the family, but these are the various species they used, and they took one of the Remingtonocetids, or Remingtonocetids, and they took a protocetid Indocetus and Basilosaurus, and they also added in this creature here, which is actually a Dorodontid, a bit more dolphin-like, but sometimes they're grouped together in the same family. And they looked at the ear, the middle ear. Why did they look at the middle ear? Well, the middle ear is designed in certain ways depending on how you hear. And we hear sound that's transmitted to us through the air, whereas a whale hears sound transmitted to it through water. Now, if you've gone swimming underwater and you've tried to communicate with somebody by shouting at them, you won't do very well because the sound actually bounces off your skull and doesn't get into your head, doesn't get into your ear, and you can't receive it, and it messes up the signal. But whales manage to hear quite well underwater. So what they did, they had a look at the various organisation of different ears, and here we have the diagrams that they made. Here is a land animal. I don't know whether it was a fox, but I've given you a fox. And you'll notice that there's a complete connection here with this bit of bone. This is the eardrum, this is the outside, this is jaw, and here are the middle ear bones, and here is the cochlea, which is the hearing organ. And here we have Pachycetus, very similar except for the fact it's got this involucrum, this lump of bone here which doesn't exist over in the other terrestrial mammals, and the ear bones, we remember, were much more massive, much more solid than in other creatures. And here we have the Remingtonocetids, and here we have the same sort of structure, the involucrum, but here we have a difference which the others didn't have. You've got this fat pad connecting the jaw to the skull, and what's happening here is the marine animals actually pick up sound through their jaw, vibrations that come through the jaw and get transmitted to the inner ear bones through the bones of the skull, and not so much through the eardrum. And here we have a modern whale or dolphin type creature, dolphin or whale, I think this is a dolphin, and we have the same structure, but here we have complete disconnection from the rest of the skull bones. So the sound is transmitted through the jaw, through this fat pad, into the bones here, and there's no opening to the eardrum. The eardrum is still there, but the vibrations it picks up are now not from sound but from the bone. So we have a complete different system. So here we seem to have some sort of transition, if you like, from fully terrestrial to aquatic, except this animal was fully terrestrial as well. So why has it got this lump of bone here? Well, it seems that this lump of bone here actually was associated with hearing low frequency sound. So what you actually have here is a land animal that hears low frequency sound. You have marine animals that hear low frequency sound as well. But the interesting thing here is that this animal, this kind of creature which is amphibious, spends part of its time in water and part of its time out of water, has a mixed system because it still has an opening to the air, so it can still hear sound transmitted through the air as well as sound transmitted through its jaw, through the fat pad, into the bones of its skull. And that's what you'd expect. If you design a creature to live part of the time in water, part of the time on land, you have a mixed system, a hybrid system for the hearing, so that it can function in both environments. And if you live on the land, you don't have to have a hybrid system. And if you live just in the sea and you only ever hear sound in the sea, you have a system which doesn't have an opening to the air because you don't hear sound transmitted through the air. So basically what I'm saying here is, if we have a terrestrial animal like Pachycetus, we have an ear designed for airborne sound. Low frequency airborne sound, yes, but airborne sound. Then you have the amphibious creatures, for example Remingtonocetid, and it had a hybrid system because it spends part of its life in the water, part of its life on the land. And Basilosaurus actually has an ear, I didn't show you the diagram of that one, but it has an ear remarkably similar to the modern whale because it spent most of its life living in the water, and it would have to live in water because the legs it had couldn't have carried it around on the land. And we're going to come back to the Basilosaurus legs as well. But let's just move in a bit further into the inner ear. Inside your inner ear you have what's called semicircular canals, which allow you to stand up straight and to walk around without falling over, the organs of balance. And the way you move around is reflected by the design of your semicircular canals. So your semicircular canals are oriented, so you've got one that goes up and down vertically, one that's horizontally, and one that goes in that way, crossways. So you can actually detect movements when you turn your head like this and as you move along. But if you're going to do a lot of acrobatics, you might find yourself getting rather dizzy. So the theory is that semicircular canal size actually varies depending on the kind of activities you do. And if you rotate a lot when you move around, like a whale would do in water, you don't want to have such large semicircular canals because the movements of the fluid inside the canals would actually keep going round and you would find yourself getting very dizzy. So the whales have smaller semicircular canals than land mammals because they have a much more mobile existence and they're making more acrobatic movements through the water. So here you have a terrestrial mammal. This is actually a bush baby, and here you have a dolphin, and that's pretty much the same scale, not quite. That's actually a bit larger, but the semicircular canals are much smaller in proportion to the rest of the ear. Here we have a bush baby. Here we have this is a terrestrial Pachycetid-like animal, one of the species. This is one of the seal-like creatures, one of the protocetids, and here we have a dolphin, the bottlenose dolphin. But to make sure you're actually understanding the information correctly, you actually have to plot out the size of the semicircular canal against something like body mass, and you'd expect some sort of ratio. And this is what you find. Now here we have a graph showing two lines. This line here is terrestrial animals, and this line here are living whales or so-called fossil whales or similar creatures that live in water. And I want to focus on this one, this is IP. This is actually a species very similar to Pachycetus. This is a land animal, and these are all land animals here. All these crosses and all these letters are all land animals. And Pachycetus sits nicely in the land animals. So the semicircular canal is the size you would expect it to be for its body size, and it's no different from any other land animal. And then you've got 3 creatures here, which are all fossil whales. Here we've got the Remingtonocetus, this is Indocetus, and this is Dorodon, the dolphin-like animal, and they all sit in the same area as the marine animals, or animals that live in water. And there's no gradual. If you were an evolutionist, you might predict a gradual change from this to this, but in fact you haven't got a gradual change. Okay, they're this side of the line, but they're well in with the others. This creature here is nearer to the Pachycetus than the others. But the point here is you haven't got a slow gradual change that you would expect from Darwinian evolution. You've got very abrupt change, and the semicircular canals of these marine animals are adapted to their marine lifestyle to allow them to go through very acrobatic movements without getting dizzy, putting it simply. So again, if you look at the terrestrial animals, they group with the non-cetaceans, in other words the terrestrial animals or animals that live on land. And you've got the amphibious creatures and other creatures that lived in the sea, either part of the time or all the time, have the semicircular canal, the same dimensions as the whales, the cetaceans, and seem to be fully adapted to that kind of environment. There's no gradual Darwinian change. And if you read the paper by Numella et al., you'll find that they actually say that. They say this is a very abrupt change. It's not slow, gradual Darwinianism. They don't, as a result, conclude that Darwinianism might be wrong, but they just point out this fact. They're honest enough to say, yeah, this is interesting, it's unusual, you didn't expect this, but they're still evolutionists. But they do admit there's no gradual transition from one to the other. It's a very abrupt, almost as if the animals were designed for that particular lifestyle. And this is what I would actually suggest is the truth. Okay, let's look at the hind limbs. Things get really interesting when you start talking about hind limbs. Now you get Basilosaurus had hind limbs attached to a pelvis, but not to the vertebral column, which is an interesting arrangement of itself. But the evolution of modern whales predicts a reduction of hind limbs. Okay, and it also predicts that hind limbs will become vestigial. And in fact, they say that the hind limbs now in modern whales have become vestigial and part of the reproductive tract of the whale. And they would suggest also that you get from time to time, you get atavisms, you get atavistic hind limbs that show the evolutionary past of the whale. Let's start looking at Basilosaurus. Here we have the hind limb of Basilosaurus, very small, whoops. And here we have a large picture of it. And it does seem to be a complete hind limb. You can't really argue about that. It's got all the bits and pieces. It's got a femur, it's got the fibula and the tibia, and it's got the ankle bones here and toe bones sticking out here. And here's how they think they were arranged. They seem to be functioning limbs, except for the fact that this is the size of the creature and here its legs. Rather small, you think. Not much use. There's certainly not much use walking around on land. Now, the way Basilosaurus moves seems to have been like an eel, like a giant eel, 24 meters long. And I would suggest to you that they were using the limbs to anchor the body to the ground, to the subsurface under the water, because they lived in shallow water. Before we move on though, let's just remind ourselves what an atavism is. An atavism is a reversion to a previous evolutionary stage, and a vestige is a reduced organ that serves a different function from the original in the evolutionary ancestor. Notice the vestigial organ is not useless. When evolutionists first discovered vestigial organs, they claimed they were useless. Now they say, oh no, they're not useless, they just do something else. They're reduced form, maybe, and they do something different. They've actually redefined vestige to fit with the known evidence. But if you're going to say that something is an atavism or vestige, you have to be able to demonstrate something called homology. You have to show that the reduced features you've got there actually are very similar to the previous features. So, for example, take the hind limbs of whales, the small reduced hind limbs. Do you have all the same bones in that hind limb that you would find in a normal limb? And if you can't show that, you can't really claim that they're homologous, that they're a vestige or an atavism. We're going to carry on with come back to that again. But we should also note in passing that atavisms and vestiges are perfectly consistent with what's called the basic type model, which is a creationist model of understanding animal kinds, basically saying that God created basic types of animal, and you might expect some sort of variation, and you could expect an atavism or a vestige within a creationist biology. But they're limited in scope. Okay, that's atavisms and vestiges. Here we have a picture of some of the vestige, so-called vestige of the legs in a whale. They look like legs, don't they? Oh no, they don't. Oh, okay. Let's just think a bit about homology. To demonstrate homology, you have to use three things, basically. You have to have the same fundamental structure. So we can conclude this as a leg, because it's got the leg bones. It should have the same relationship to the surrounding characters, and it should also have the same embryonic development. And these are the features that have been identified by people who've worked in this area, particularly with fossil whale legs, and whale legs in general. And, okay, we can suggest that this is probably a leg, and we wouldn't be too worried about that. But are these legs? Again, this is a dolphin, these are the bones, which we're told are vestiges of the legs, which are now part of the reproductive system. Well, I actually think that if we just focus on the function that they perform today, we get a much better idea of what they are. And in fact, if you look at the research that's been done, homology has actually been rejected because of the way the bones are actually attached to the rest of the body. A different musculature and innervation, in other words, the way the muscles and the nerves are attached to the bone and linked to the bone to make them work or do whatever they do is different. And in fact, if you look at this organisation here, which is the bones from a right whale, in the reproductive area of the right whale, they're not arranged in the same way that leg bones are. You've got different muscles attaching, these muscles attaching here, and they're linked up in a funny way. And it seems to me rather unlikely, but in fact, the evolutionists will admit quite freely that the way the nerves are wired up and the way the muscles are arranged show that they're not homologous with limbs in terrestrial mammals. So they actually do admit this. So they're going to have to say, well, we've done a bit of different, things have changed somewhat markedly, and we can't really establish an evolutionary link. And the bones are actually embedded in the musculature of the abdominal wall, which is not where your legs are. Your legs stick out, they don't stick in your gut, which is what these are doing, or more exactly in your genital region. And there's actually, you haven't got a tibia and a fibula, you've only got one. Which one have you got? Well, again, you'd expect two here, or somewhere down here. You don't have, they're just a series of bones linked together, single bones. So the argument that there is homology here is actually very weak, and evolutionists admit that it's very weak. But they do go and say, well, okay, look at embryos of these cetaceans, and you see legs developing. Here we have a picture of an embryo of a dolphin, and you've got something that is labelled H for hind limb, F for forelimb, that's a flipper, and this is the hind limb of the dolphin, so we're told. And you can actually get a series, different stages, and here we've got the limb, and sometimes they're a bit more easy to see than others. This is younger and this is older, but as the development goes on, they shrink and disappear, and they get incorporated basically into the body wall in the genital region. But when you're looking at these pictures, you have to remember some lessons from human embryology. If you look at a human embryo, some people say, ah, look, we have a tail. Well, as everyone knows, it's not a tail at all. It's actually a coccyx, which supports the muscles around your rear and makes it very easy to sit down, and helps you also to do other certain important bodily functions. But without that, you wouldn't be able to function. But it looks like a tail in the embryo. And then you get so-called gill slits. Well, not gill slits at all, actually. They're pharyngeal pouches, and they look like pouches, and they look a bit like slits. But they look quite large, and they look quite prominent in the embryo. But as the embryo develops and grows, and turns into a baby, then as you develop into an adult, the various proportions change. So if you're looking at the position and size of various features in an embryo, and then trying to conclude something about what they are, you could actually make a mistake, as people have made with tails and gill slits. So I would suggest to you that these bones are bones which are developing because they're going to be incorporated into the reproductive tract of the creatures as they grow. And nothing to do with legs at all. So the relative size and positions of developing organs is not a definitive criteria to establish homology. It's very dodgy, very, very shaky grounds to which base your theory. Okay, so the evolutionist is still carrying on with his various bits of evidence. Let's move on to genetics. Genetics of limb loss. Now, there are certain creatures around which seem to have lost their legs, snakes. And most people, I'm fairly happy with the idea that snakes have lost their legs. And some people have looked at the genetics of how this happens. And they've compared the way the legs of a snake develops and the way the limbs of a chick develops. Chickens are very easy to work with because they hatch out in an egg. You can do lots of embryological work quite easily on a chicken. And basically you've got various genes which are controlling the development of your legs, or if you're a chicken, rather the development of your legs if you're a chicken. The HOX genes, HOX C6, C8 and to 10 genes are switching on various other genes to make the limbs grow. And the regulatory sequence controls the expression of these HOX genes, which then control the way the legs develop. I'm not going to go into more detail about that, it's too complicated. But basically, if you get a change in the regulatory sequence, your body gets longer and your legs fall off and you become a snake. Okay? So they said, okay, this happens in snakes, maybe it happens in whales. Maybe if whales have evolved from four-legged creatures, we would expect to find the same changes in the genetic control in the whale as we find in the snake. If you're an evolutionist, you would. So some of these guys looked at it, looked at the various regulatory sequence in the genes, and they found that 5 species of baleen whales, these are the whales that catch the krill with the big baleen plates, have a regulatory sequence different from tetrapods. They've got a different control sequence. Whereas if you are saying that your whale has evolved from a normal tetrapod, you would expect to have the same sequence, but they'd be switched off. And that's not what they found. There'd been 12 other whales. They found that they were conserved, so they were the same. Oh, hang on. So 5 were different and 12 were the same. So their conclusion was a simple evolutionary change in the HOX gene expression or HOX gene regulation is unlikely to have driven loss of hind limbs in cetaceans. So what they're saying is basically we don't know how the legs have been switched off, if they ever had legs in the first place. And this is the paper, a couple of guys, Bedger and Hall, 2002. It's in Nature as well. And they looked at the various genetic sequences and control systems for the legs. But they concluded that we don't know how the whales lost their legs. Well, maybe they didn't. Let's just think about atavistic hind limbs. Now, you'll have read, no doubt, if you've done any research in whales, that from time to time there have been reports of whales with rear legs sticking out of their body wall. That's what we're told. Most of the reports are actually quite old. The most modern ones are about the 1950s, late 1950s, basically because whaling stopped after that time. But a lot of this information is actually very old. Papers written in the 1800s, it's quite interesting reading. And here's a picture of some that they found on a sperm whale back in 1919. So look, legs. It's a throwback to its evolutionary past. Well, okay, do they look like legs? Let's compare it with the right whale, the modern right whale today, normal right whale if you like. And here they've got these bones here. I would like to suggest to you that actually these are deformed versions of these bones. We're doing a cross-species comparison that makes it rather difficult. But if you have a genetic impoverished race of animals, what do you start getting? You start getting defects. What happened to the whales? They were hunted almost to extinction. So you've got a very small gene pool. You might get inbreeding and you might get genetic defects. And your genetic defects might mess up these bones, which are part of your reproductive system, and cause these bones to stick out in funny ways. Let's just have a look at the detail again. Here we can try and link up the bones. There's one hidden under here, under all the muscles. But there are 4 bones sticking out, and there were 4 bones to start with. This is actually a different species, but the comparison is probably reasonable to make. And in case you're wondering what these are actually these 2 bones here belong with here, and these 2 bones come from here. They've actually split up the leg, or so-called leg. And they claim this looks like a leg. Well, it doesn't look like any leg I've ever seen. Where's the tibia and fibia? Where's the ankle bones? What's this bit up here? Well, actually some of it's cartilage and not even bone. So if you want to believe it's a leg, you might be able to, at a stretch, believe that's a leg, but I certainly don't believe that's a leg. It looks like a few bits of bone sticking out from where they should be. Okay, let's have a look at the hind limbs of Basilosaurus. Why did Basilosaurus have hind limbs? Well, the current most common theory is that there were claspers to aid copulation. When you're a very long animal and you want to mate, you've got to be able to line things up properly, and your hind limbs could help you do that. Well, actually, that's possible, but as I said before, Basilosaurus probably lived in shallow mangrove or seagrass habitat, and you can tell that from the rocks that they find the fossils in. They've got the remains of some sort of mangrove plant or seagrass plant. So a very shallow habitat. It moved like an eel. If you want to move through a shallow habitat and you're 24 meters long and you want to turn very quickly, it might be very useful to anchor your rear on the seabed and to turn around that way. So I would suggest that actually would have worked quite well as legs, anchoring the body in a shallow habitat, allowing you to make rapid turns. So we've got some function. So we don't have to look at these things and say they're vestiges. They had some function and purpose. Which brings me to the final part of my presentation, looking at design of these creatures. So if we're saying, no, these creatures are not an evolutionary transition to modern whales, we would look to see how they were designed and whether they were designed for a specific lifestyle or not. And I think you can do that. And you can do this within the context of what I would call creation biology. But in creation biology, let's just remember, we can expect variation to be quite extensive and rapid, but we would expect to be bounded true to type. So we would have a concept of types of animals, and you always breed true to type, but you can have a lot of variation in the type of creature that you have. For example, the horse. There's a lot of variation in the horses, and the fossil horse series I would have no problem with. It's just a variation within a kind. But the changes are restricted to modification or loss of existing structures. You can't get some new structures, so you don't grow a wing when you didn't have a wing before. But you can lose your legs, like if you're a snake. But function is always the key. In biology, the human body doesn't have bits and pieces that aren't doing anything. They're always doing something. And evolutionists in the past have come along and said, this organ is a vestige, we don't need it anymore, we can take it out, like the thymus. And they took out the thymuses of various babies, and they didn't do very well, they died. It's a rather essential organ. So function is the key. We always look for a function, and that we would expect the various features of any animal to have a function. Whereas the evolutionists would say, no, we're quite happy with vestiges that don't do anything, which are now useless. So Pakicetus, the so-called walking whale from Pakistan, is actually a very well-designed running creature. It's got ankle bones very like an antelope, and antelopes, as you know, are very good at running. So this creature would be very good at running. So it was a land mammal, legs designed for running. It had these heavy ear ossicles which allowed it to hear low-frequency sound, just like an elephant today can hear low-frequency sound. Now I don't know what the ear ossicles of an elephant look like, but I'd be very interested to know. And there's a test that we could do in the theory and say, well, is this true? And the teeth are consistent with the diet of shellfish, although that's not conclusive. Just because you have sharp pointed teeth doesn't necessarily mean you ate shellfish, but it could be. So there the story is consistent. So it could have been an animal that was living in coastal areas, close to rivers, but no more amphibious than a tapir is what they generally say. So we have a creature which seems to be well adapted to running around on the land. The question is, why would it want to change into a whale? I don't see any good reason when you've got lots of when the land is easily inhabited. The evolutionists say, oh well, there was an ecological niche that opened up, so the Pakicetus moved into it. But why? I don't understand why it would do that. Okay, but it's a wolf-like creature running around the land, seemed to be well designed for land. So I don't think it had anything to do with whales at all. Then you've got the Ambulocetidae. The Ambulocetus, the crocodile-like creature, again a very well adapted creature with a lifestyle just like crocodile. Amphibious, short limbs and large feet to allow it to move around in rivers, which is where it seemed to live. It was adapted for paddle swimming, designed for paddle swimming, strong teeth and jaws to catch its prey, and it was basically a crocodile-like creature. Then you've got the Remingtonocetids. Now, even evolutionists admit this is really nothing to do with the evolution of whales, because it's what they call a side branch, an evolutionary dead end. And it was actually an otter-like creature. It would have lived like an otter, and all that we know about the bone structure of this creature suggests it had a lifestyle just like an otter. And remember, its ears had ears like for an amphibious existence, a mixture of hearing in the air and in water. But it's a very strange skull, not at all like a whale. It's very small, otter-sized. Well, there are small whale-like animals today. And its ear structure is consistent with an amphibious existence. And its vertebral column is very similar to otters, suggests it moved like an otter. But it was very different from all the other so-called archaeocetes. So I would even question whether it was related in any way to any of the other fossil families that we've looked at. Then you've got the Protocetids. These are shortened but strong limbs and elongated digits, which will allow them to swim through the water, flippers if you like. So it would be a seal-like animal adapted to living mainly in the water, and these creatures were found in marine deposits but they were designed for paddle swimming. So we have a creature that seems to be just like modern seals, or would have filled a similar ecological niche. And then the Basilosaurus, extremely elongated spine, small head in proportion to the body, unlike the whales. So if this was on the way to becoming a whale, it wouldn't have such a small head. You'd expect the head to get larger, to be moving gradually towards the large head size of a modern whale, and the head of a modern whale, of the baleen whales at least, was about a third of the body size. Huge. A flexible elbow joint, absence of polyphalange, in other words, it didn't have lots of extra bones in its fingers to make big flippers, so it could actually have had webbed feet. We don't really know. That's a hypothesis of my own. And the small hind limbs, which I think would have helped it to anchor in the shallow marine environment that it lived in. Designed for shallow water existence. And then we have the Dorodontidae. These are dolphin-like. Now, these are perhaps the most convincing fossil you have in the evolutionary sequence. If you're looking for a fossil that looks a bit like a transition from a terrestrial animal to a whale, well, this is not such a bad one. It's got the hind legs, and it's a bit like a dolphin. It hasn't got the elongated spine of the Basilosaurus, but it's actually not that much like a dolphin. And it might even be the same basic kind as the Basilosaurids. But here is a skull of a dolphin in comparison, and it's remarkably different. The dolphin skull has a big dent in it here, and that's for its echolocation system, which nobody really understands even today. We don't really know how it works and how the dolphin uses echolocation, but it has a very large organ in here called the melon, which allows it to echolocate. Its teeth are completely different. In fact, there are other features of the dolphin too, which are completely different from the Dorodontids, so I don't even believe that these ones were ancestors to dolphins. When we look at the modern cetaceans, this is where it gets really difficult for the evolutionist, because basically they've got a group of fossils which they say they can link together, but in the end of the day look like separate families designed for different environments. But then you've got to explain where echolocation came from. Now, we don't even understand how it works, let alone how we got animals with echolocation, and that applies to bats as well as dolphins. And then you've got the physiological and anatomical features that facilitate deep diving. Now, that's not an easy thing to come by. You try diving deeper than a couple of meters and you'll be struggling. The whales can go down miles deep and stay down for half an hour and have no adverse effects. You can't do that with just a bit of practice. You've got to be designed to do it. Where did baleen come from? Where's the evolutionary transition from teeth, where you've got your teeth in Pachycetus or the Basilosaurus teeth? How do they transform into baleen? And in fact, the only feature that links the modern cetaceans, the modern whales, with Pachycetus is the heavy ear ossicles and involucrum, which is why I say if you want to know if you have a whale, you look in its ear. Well, even I don't believe that, because that's the only link, and that's a rather tenuous link if you ask me, to prove that whales evolved from terrestrial animals called Pachycetids. And if you want to know a bit more about the basic kinds of creature that God would have created in the beginning, we would have to look at various relationships between the modern cetaceans, for example, and we would look to see if there are hybrids that could form, and that would, if you could hybridize with another animal, you would consider that to be the same species or same kind. And actually this does happen in the whale families. You get something called a wolfin, spelt with or without an H depending on who you are, and it's actually a whale-dolphin hybrid, and there's one very famous one with a false killer whale male and an Atlantic dolphin female, produce an offspring. That's dad and that's mum and that's baby. Quite a big baby by now. But these are the hybrids, and if you want to know whether you've got animals belonging to the same group, the same basic kind, you would expect at least that they could hybridize. You can't always do the test, of course, but it's very interesting to look at different information available on hybrids, and it helps us to understand a bit more about creation biology. So I want to now draw some conclusions from that very rapid tour of different areas of biology. There is actually a discontinuity in the fossil record. There's no way you can get from a Basilosaurus to a baleen whale, so to the blue whale, for example. And in fact, I don't think there's any way you can get from the other creatures either. And I don't believe that the extant cetaceans, in other words, the ones living today, are descended from the so-called archaeocetes. The only link is the bone in the ear. And the whale basic kinds never had hind limbs. And the teeth, where present, are actually dissimilar from the archaeocetes, the so-called ancient whales. Now, we do need some further research to be done on the various basic kinds of cetaceans if we're going to have a consistent creation biology of the whales. And that's hopefully something that can be built on as the future goes on. The reason I put that one in is because some people say that creationists never have hypotheses that you can work with when you're doing creation biology, whereas evolution has lots of useful hypotheses, like about which organ you can take out and do without. Not so useful. But, but we can look at the biology, we can apply the creation model and say we can make certain predictions. And we would expect to be able to look at the hybridization, for example, and to say that here we have a group of one basic kind of whale because we've got hybrids that can be produced. So there is research that we can do from a biblical basis. But that is basically the end of my talk